Hello and welcome to this Press Club of Long Island panel discussion, Reflections on the Elections. The media may receive general criticism that we cover political campaigns as if they're horse races, and this evening there are many horse races that are still rounding the clubhouse turn, but we'll do the best we can with our panel of local, well, I guess it's in the tradition of journalism's motto, go with what you've got, and we've got some authorities who will help us assess where we are and what's ahead. We will be discussing the elections, what they mean for Long Island, impact here, how we impacted the elections, and our political cultures. We'll explore also the transformative technologies and platforms of today for today's journalists and how aspiring journalists will provide reliable information for their generation to make responsible decisions today and in the future. So, I am David North of the Press Club Board, and I'd like to welcome you and introduce you to our panelists. And panelists, please give a wave to our viewers as I introduce you so that all can find you and address their questions to you during the question and answer. Someone who you may recognize if you are on Long Island, thousands recognize him throughout the island as a reporter and anchor for News 12 Long Island. He is managing editor, Rich Barrabi. And Rich, welcome. I don't think we've met. It's a pleasure to meet you via Zoom. By the way, folks who are with us from outside of the New York area, just note Long Island is about 160 miles long. It's home to nearly 3 million people. And somehow Rich and his colleagues at News 12 managed to transcend time and space to tie us together as a community. And much respect for that, Rich. The 10 p.m. newscast. He is the host of News 12's weekly program, Power and Politics. Joseph Shaw is, I've just met Joseph a moment ago. Hello. He's a multimedia journalist, executive editor of the Express News Group, who publish 4 community newspapers. And those include the Southampton Press and 2 websites rather, serving Long Island's South Fork. Do we have Dr. Laura Lindenfeld? Is Dr.
Hi.
Lindenfeld present?
Hi.
Hello, and it's a pleasure to meet you. We've been emailing back and forth today, so just by way of introduction, Dr. Lindenfeld of Stony Brook University is Executive Director of the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science, and Dr. Lindenfeld is also Dean of the Stony Brook University School of Journalism. Thank you so much for joining our panel tonight. Jack Sirica of Newsday may or may not recognize me. We worked together briefly when I was doing the Newsday.com News Minute several years ago.
I do.
Wave on the way to the studio. Thank you for joining us today, Jack. Jack is Deputy Assistant Managing Editor, specializing in local and national politics. His eyes are on Washington, but he is a longtime editor at Newsday's Long Island desk. Jack will compare and contrast alleged high crimes and misdemeanors and threats to democracy during the Nixon era and today. So Jack, maybe an MVP on the panel, not to put pressure on you. And Lawrence Levy, also a familiar face throughout Long Island and New York. He's recognized for his work as a reporter, columnist, and political analyst for Newsday for many years. Television viewers will also recognize Larry as the go-to authority for politics on News 12 Long Island, especially during election season. And he is also, or was also, a co-host not so long ago for Long Island Public Television's issues program, Face Off. And in 2007, this is the reason we are so pleased to have him with us today, Hofstra University recognized Lawrence Levy as uniquely qualified to create and lead their National Center for Suburban Studies. And well, as you know, anyone who lives here may be familiar with this motto or phrase that Long Island is known as Long Island's first suburb. So we'll see if your research for the Center for National Suburban Studies correlates with the outcome of local and national elections. Are we on Long Island a typical suburb, or is there a difference between what's consistent and what's typical for Long Island? I think that'll be our jump-in question for Larry Levy.
Sure, I'll get started with that. Well, it was a wacky year. Most years, Long Island is the quintessential suburb, that what happens in Nassau and Suffolk pretty much reflects what happens in the suburbs around the country. And what happens in the suburbs around the country determines who gets the keys to the White House and who gets the majority gavels in Congress. It's been almost unfailing. There's a couple of years in there in the last 30 or so where you could argue depending on the definition of a suburb, but by and large it's true, and it was true this cycle as well. In 2016, Donald Trump carried the suburbs, and that includes kind of farther flung exurbs like eastern Brookhaven and its equivalent around the country by about 4 points. And this time around, he lost between 2 and 3 points according to exit polls. That's about a 6 to 7 point swing, which is pretty steep. The farther away, the closer you are to cities in major American suburbs, the bluer it is. It's part of an evolution in the last 20, 30 years from reliably red to purple and now on to blue. But once you get outside those so-called collar counties, like Nassau, Westchester, Bergen, outside of Philadelphia, Delaware, Bucks, outside of Atlanta, Clayton, Gwinnett, Cobb, and DeKalb, they become redder. And we're going to see, I think, when the votes are finally counted, that one of the fault lines of American politics is pretty much Route 110 or maybe 111, probably more like 111, where west of it toward the city will have gone for Joe Biden the way it did in 2016 for Clinton, and before that for Obama both times, I believe both times. Jack can correct me on that if he has it at his fingertips. And east, it was Donald Trump territory and is very much likely to stay Donald Trump territory. So the answer is we were a little different, and I think, and we'll probably get into this with other people, we were a little bit more Republican this time around. Again, we have to wait till the votes are counted. And I think that was actually some local and statewide issues that you didn't see in other places that actually challenged the national dynamic. Bail reform, the money that the Republicans were able to raise, the target that a lot of legislative Democrats put on their backs, and the ability of still strong local Republican organizations to hit the bullseye.
Larry, I think that was the point I wanted to make. Are we who we think we are? And we'll be talking to our other panelists about their perspectives from their communities and their points of view professionally. You mentioned the East End, and some would say that line of demarcation may be 110 or even 112 farther east, which is why, again, I'm pleased to have Joe Shaw with us this evening to give us a word from, well, covering mostly the South Fork. Some would regard the South Fork as an outpost of Manhattan. So I'm very curious about what you found out there. Blue, red, a mix. What was the scene in your observation this year, Joe?
As usual, it was a mix, although it gets much bluer the further east you go. East Hampton tends to be pretty reliably Democratic. Right now, it's very difficult to read the tea leaves. There's a lot of absentee ballots. I think countywide, I want to say 140,000 absentee ballots to count. They started that this week, obviously. But even in the first district, I was surprised at the margin of victory on election day for U.S. Representative Lee Zeldin for his fourth term. I expected him to win. I think everybody expected the incumbent to likely win. He's done a very good job with constituent outreach, things like that, the little things that really do keep people voting for you. But I was a little surprised it wasn't closer, and I honestly don't think, even with the absentee ballots that are still to be counted, they are heavily Democratic, but it'll close the gap a little bit, but it's not going to overturn that race most likely, I don't think. And that was a little bit of a surprise because a few months ago, we had reported that the Democrats had enrolled at a much faster pace than the Republican Party did over the last year or so. And they added to their totals to the point where in the first district, at least, which is, most of the East End, the first district was now pretty much balanced Democrat, Republican, and independent / blanks. Those three groups are almost equal now. For years, the Republicans held the numbers. They held a very sizable numbers advantage. They don't really have that sizable numbers advantage anymore. So it seemed like it might portend a closer race in the first district, but it didn't really come to pass that way. And as I said, that's not a race that I think is going to change significantly with the absentee ballots. And also the state Senate race ended up being fairly comfortably the Republican candidate, Mr. Palumbo. That wasn't a shock, but it was the size of the margin was different. So I do think the size of the Republican vote on the East End shouldn't be underestimated. It's a sizable number of people, and we do have a mix, but the Republican Party is still certainly in the first district appears to still be the dominant party.
Joe, I am personally pleased that I have an opportunity to talk to you and introduce you to the rest of the island. We're talking about some stereotypes. I was joking about the South Fork being an outpost of Manhattan, but in my experience, the South Fork is a microcosm of Long Island, and Long Island is a microcosm of America. Could you briefly describe some of the issues that your readers, your constituents were concerned about in this election? I know immigration is one of them, and housing. You wouldn't think from a stereotypically wealthy community that there'd be so many income disparities and issues of that sort, social issues.
Yeah, absolutely. Those are big issues for us. Bail reform, I think, is interesting because I think that did have some effect on the ballot this year. That was a conversation that happened quite a bit locally about the bail reform measures. You know, the South Fork was kind of a microcosm in many ways because we had probably 6, 7, 8 rallies by local Black Lives Matters organizations throughout the South Fork over the last few months. And we also had very sizable caravans of Trump supporters come through all the way to Montauk in a real show of force, I think. That happened more than once as well. So it was sort of a battleground, and I think you're right. This area, I think the South Fork in particular, is really a microcosm of the bigger picture. It's very, very divided. You have people very strongly in both directions in this community. The good news is we've been able to get along. It hasn't broken out into anything unpleasant here, which is terrific, and I think is a testament to the organizers of the events. I know that the organizers of the Black Lives Matters events made a point of working with local police, and their message was very much, the tone of the message was, this isn't about all police, it's about the issues that need to be addressed. So those things were big parts of the campaign this year, and I think you see the divide here, just as you said. I think it's the same divide that's everywhere right now, and it was a little surprising to me again that the Republicans were as strong as they were, because I did expect a little more participation locally from Democrats, and there was also a conversation about whether Manhattan folks were going to change their registration to vote on the East End, where it would really matter more, and there was some evidence that was happening to some degree, but I just think ultimately the way it all turned out, it ended up not being as big a factor as we thought it was going to be.
And of course, candidates still go there to harvest some money.
Oh, absolutely.
So Joe, thank you. And we're looking forward to including you in future press club activities and being able to give more coverage to the issues of the South Fork, which are our
Perfect.
issues. I forgot to mention this great deal of agriculture issues there too.
Absolutely.
Rich Barrabi, hello. I don't know that we've crossed trails professionally, at least not recently, but one thing, speaking of here and there, News 12 is everywhere on TVs and devices throughout Long Island, and your colleagues are physically everywhere on Long Island. You know us and many of our communities very well. We may be an island, but 2 boroughs of New York City comprise our West End. Do you think New York City issues associated with COVID-19, social unrest had much of an impact on voting here on Long Island, maybe beyond Nassau County, which might seem more obvious?
Sure, I really do think they did, David, and it kind of goes back to what Larry was talking about earlier. I think some of the initiatives that the Democratic-controlled state government was able to push forward over the past 2 years really played to Republican candidates' advantage this year. If you think back to 2018, you had a blue wave across the country. You also had a blue wave on Long Island, the state Senate in particular. Tremendous blue wave there, really a lot of changes, and allowed the Democrats to push forward with very progressive initiatives. And there was definitely a certain segment of voters here on Long Island who said, wait a minute, that may work for New York City, that doesn't work for us. And you watch the Republicans throughout this campaign. We actually did a story specifically on this on News 12, and I interviewed Larry for the story. Republican candidates were tying their Democratic opponents to Bill de Blasio. And whether or not there was a real connection, the fact that they made the connection, it worked to a certain extent. We went out, we talked to folks, we showed them the political ads. I remember one woman in particular from Belmore telling me, I don't know if de Blasio is tied to Monica Martinez or Kevin Thomas or not, but if there's a chance they are, I'm voting for the opponent. So I definitely think as much as Donald Trump played a role at the top of the ticket, convincing people to vote one way or another, it was Bill de Blasio, who was not on the ticket and who Long Islanders could not vote for even if he were, who really did play an outsized role in determining a lot of decisions, especially for those down ballot races.
Rich, thank you. Just as someone who is responsible for covering an enormous island like this, did you find that the pockets of red and blue were clearly demarked? I know just last year, Newsday began its series about segregation on the island. Did you find that any of that was also reflected in political outcomes?
Yeah, there's no question about it, David. And when you look, especially at some of the assembly or Senate districts, you see that bear out as well, where there are certain districts that where Long Island overall may be a battleground, there's no doubt in a particular district a Republican's going to win or a Democrat's going to win. And that plays out community to community as well. It's something, as you said, Newsday's been talking about for years. News 12 has as well. There are, you think about Meadowbrook Parkway, right? And some of the divisions there. East of Meadowbrook Parkway, more Republican, predominantly more white. West of Meadowbrook Parkway, more Democratic, predominantly majority communities. So that played out something on the national stage, but also within Long Island, when you dig down into the numbers, you see that as well.
That's why when I look from my perspective at what you're doing, I just think it's fascinating. What is the biggest challenge for you as you try to serve so many different people across such a distance, cultural, social, economic? That must be really fascinating each day.
You know, I think what we really try to do, David, is you have to ask the pointed, specific questions that need to be asked, but you also have to do it in a delicate way. And what I say by that is, you don't want to make people feel as if there's an agenda. And right now in this country and on Long Island, if you take someone to task who is on the other side of the political spectrum as your viewers, they are going to accuse you of bias. By the way, it doesn't matter which way you're directing the question, and it doesn't matter who's watching. So our challenge is to present the information as it is, ask the questions that have to be asked, but at the same time, be respectful of the moment that we're in and the emotions that people are feeling, and try to navigate that. It isn't easy for any of us, whether you're in TV, print, social, but it's something that we're all trying to grapple with and do the best we can with.
Thank you, Rich, because I know at one point reporters were looked at as advocates for whatever group. Now we get suspicion from every direction. So I'm sure you have to work with, especially your younger reporters who may be less experienced. And speaking of younger reporters, in addition to our program, extremely pleased to welcome, because she will have insights into a lot of subjects that are important to our viewers tonight, especially our younger viewers who may be aspiring journalists. She is Dr. Laura Lindenfeld of Stony Brook University. She is the Dean of the School of Journalism and Executive Director for the Alan Alda Center for Communicating Science. And the moderator gets one wise guy question per panelist. I'm going to use mine up on you right now.
Lucky me.
Well, when you meet new students, do you have to communicate who is Alan Alda?
I'll tell you what's very funny. The students don't necessarily know, but when you get in the elevator with Alan Alda, with, say, women of a certain age, and they start swooning, you realize there's a little bit of a generational divide. It is amazing, though, because he obviously right now is not coming to campus, but in the past, he would come and visit quite a bit. And sometimes there would be a student, 18, 19 years old, who would run up and say, "Hawkeye Pierce," growing up watching MASH. So, and he's always very generous with his time and energy.
and clearly his priorities are front and center when he supports science and knowledge, which begs the obvious question, along with hostility toward reporters. This election in particular, and perhaps the last several years, we've seen hostility toward journalists and toward science, even basic science such as wearing a mask, maintaining social distance to limit COVID. Are you feeling a sense of mission, or do you feel you have to communicate that to students, or do they come aboard knowing that and understanding how important their role as journalists will be?
I think the students are 100% on board with this. I think if anything, when I spoke with a number of students before coming tonight to really hear from them, because I'm not in the classroom and we're not interacting on the floor, because I see them occasionally in the studio or the newsroom, and they're in there with doors open, freezing cold, doing weather casting or whatever it is they're doing. It's pretty amazing. What I'm hearing from them is a number of things. And this is a story wound up in what's happening to students in general, is that they're feeling isolated, and especially the journalism students, the combination of COVID, Black Lives Matter, the election, all of these pressures, having their classes mostly online, often asynchronous. There's just a lot of feelings of alienation and distress. And I know from some of the students, we've really moved toward digital journalism in the school. Working in teams, it's hard when they're remote. They can't really connect with each other. I'm sure for many of you, that's the same feeling. They're trying to adapt. They can't go out on the streets. A lot of our students come from the boroughs. So they're home in a bunk bed, maybe sharing a space with a sibling, trying to do their reporting assignments. What I've heard from them is that they feel, and this echoes on a previous comment, they're feeling a stronger moral standpoint on their roles as journalism, and a stronger sense of commitment, but they're also worried about being called out for being biased. One of them said to me, "This is a remarkable time. I think I'm going to look back 20 years from now and imagine, what would it have been like if I had learned to be a journalist at a different time?" It's a real transition point to be learning what this profession is at a time when journalists are getting attacked, facts are getting attacked, science is being called into question. So what I've come away with from talking with them is that it's heightened for them the incredible importance of journalism as part of democracy, which makes me so happy and thrilled. And on the one hand, they may be concerned about threats toward them or role models of theirs, but they're feeling more and more energy around committing to journalism as a profession and understanding we cannot have a vital democracy without this particular role. So I'm really heightened. I'm really thrilled by this heightened sense of responsibility and what it's done for their feelings about being an American citizen and participating, despite all of these challenges they're facing.
Laura, that's so important for all of us to hear, especially if we may become a little cynical as we get on in our profession. But it's a reminder, especially talking to young people, to remember who we are so we remember why we care. I'm going to put this on your shoulders too. I know through the years, I've seen many more young women trying to enter the profession of journalism. A recent inductee into the Long Island Journalism Hall of Fame, Pat Milton, who's now a producer for CBS 60 Minutes, long time with the AP, said when she began her career, she had to call herself, her name's Patricia, she had to call herself Pat to obscure her identity. Now that we have a female vice president, we've moved on quite a bit. Is that still even a consideration for your young female students?
I think there's, there's still systemic problems around gender and race. And I think we've made great strides, but it's still not gone. And we do a lot to mentor and coach the students and empower them to be willing to take on jobs that they might be a little anxious about, or take on roles. JD, who I see on the call here, we have WSHU right on the floor with us. That was a phenomenal opportunity to move you in next door. And of course, JD is graduate of our fine program and mentors a lot of students and brings them in. So I'm trying to find opportunities to connect our students with media outlets where they can have real world experience and increase their confidence. And we're doing more and more at the school to get people directly engaged. I think that can help bridge this barrier, but I think it's still a challenge.
Can I, David?
Female vice president can't hurt. Yes, Joe.
David, can I just throw out there that in my 30 years doing this, with rare exceptions, and JD was actually one of them, the best journalists that I've seen were all women. Almost uniformly. I think women have done this job better during the 3 decades I've been doing it than most men. I think that most of my hires ended up being women because they were the most qualified candidates. And I feel like it's an industry that rewards that, because we don't have the luxury of not taking the best person, whoever that person is. And so many times the best person's a woman. So
I'm going to be sending them to you, Joe. I'll also say, in the school, we've had a real concerted effort. We had some funding from Marilyn Simons to do more reporting about Long Island. We had a series of stories come out about the Pine Barrens, and then this past year about the history of slavery on Long Island. And that was a really challenging project for the students, but appeared in Newsday, and WSHU had some features on it. And I think that's really helping to tell stories about disenfranchised people, and histories is helping empower the women and men alike in our program to speak with confidence.
We all win when we have the most effective communicators in a position where they can do their important work, our important work. You mentioned steps forward. Jack Sirica, we've made many important steps forward, but in very sad ways, I feel like we've stepped backwards on the national scene from the Watergate era to today. President Nixon was famously hostile to the press. There was a hostile relationship, but I don't think he ever referred to the press as the enemy of the people, or would have dared to. Jack, would you explain your ties to the Watergate era, your family ties, and what you think about the contrasts and comparisons between then and now with the White House and the press?
Well, thanks for having me. I appreciate it. I grew up in Washington. My father was a federal district court judge down there. And he ended up with really pretty much the whole Watergate case, from the trial of the 7 burglars, which was a straight police case in most respects, to the White House cover up the staff, Nixon's top aides, Attorney General Mitchell, and then also the constitutional battle for the White House tapes, which was really kind of almost the most interesting part of it. Yeah, I do see some parallels here. I mean, Nixon and Trump are very different characters. Nixon, as you say, had significantly more respect for the, sort of the traditions of the job and the place, the context of the presidency than Trump appears to have. I remember my father saying to me one time, he had ordered the president to turn over the White House tapes, which ended up being the end of them. And he said to me, I've thought, what am I going to do if he declines to turn them over? I'm going to send the marshals in over the fence. I mean, you sort of wonder in this particular case, where this is going to go. It's not over yet. So, but again, I don't think, I don't know. You had such serious issues there. This one appears to be, is he going to, abide by what appear to be the results of the election, or is he not? And I'm not sure, knowing him, I really don't know. So anyway, there are certainly some parallels, and the kind of the conflagration in the news media and in the country is similar, you know.
There's an enormous amount to be determined, and we are living in historic times. For folks who aren't familiar with that era, please read about it and read about Jack's father and his role in history. And I don't want to intrude too much in your family life, but was he at all concerned about you entering this profession? Or how did you feel about that, you becoming a reporter?
No, it was the opposite. He always said, geez, you know, I wish I could write. You know, he had a lot of his good friends in Washington, old-time sports writers, you know, Siegel were his friends, and most of those guys are beautiful writers. You know, Shirley Povich was the most sort of the best with the pen there. So no, he was great about it. Once I told him, look, you're famous enough, I'm not going to law school, I'm going to live my own life. He understood it, and that plan went out the window, sort of. It definitely went out, but it took a little bit of a fight on my part.
Well, your dad is a fascinating story, a jurist, an athlete, and evidently a good influence on you. You were in place to witness history. The threat of impeachment was enough to move President Nixon along. Obviously, that it wasn't enough for Donald Trump. As I understand it, as history tells us, it was Barry Goldwater who kind of tapped him on the shoulder and said, Dick, it's time to go. Do you see any figure in today's Republican Party who might tap Mr. Trump on the shoulder and say it's time to concede and move on for the good of the country? Just your analysis and observation.
I mean, I don't know who it would be, neither would do it, try to do it, or whom he would listen to, honestly. I mean, he ran against the old line Republican Party almost as much as he ran against the liberal, Democrats. He has Steve Bannon, none of them have any respect for them. I mean, I'm overstating. They really want nothing to do with them. So there aren't those kind of old line people whom he would listen to. So I really think that as he's been the last 4 years, kind of his own sounding board with the family. And, what's good about him is as people often say, is, you pretty much see what he's about. He tells you, a number of times a day, and you're not guessing as to what he's about. So I don't see anybody like that myself.
And
It would take a bundle of people to do it. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
It would take a bundle of people to include McConnell, Trump's kids, the head of the Baptist convention, somebody from each of the big political food groups that have basically been nurturing him. But there is, as Jack says, there's no individual who would even come close, including just his kids.
We'll be exploring that in further, trying to keep track of the clock here. Larry, you were a talk show host. You know, keep an eye on the clock.
Oh, yeah.
Jack, just one other thought too, just looking back at the Watergate era and today. I know many of us, some of us on the board, were inspired by the journalists of that era to know that we could make we could support justice by helping tell the truth. And it's just a very sad irony that young people and aspiring journalists today are being framed as enemies of the people who are providing fake news and experiencing hostility from the people that we're trying to serve. That must be hurtful for you. And I wonder what you tell young people who have the skills and the interest, but are discouraged about pursuing a career in journalism.
I don't know. I think Laura has a very good take on it myself. I mean, I think several very good young reporters who work with me, they're very dedicated. They work, we edit stuff, send it back. They're, usually happy to have the feedback. Not always. It gets tiresome to have editors on your case all the time. But I was very surprised by the young people, the turnout and the actual voting of young people in this election. Normally all of us, I think, have come to assume that, there's a lot of interest by young people, but it's very difficult to get them out to vote. This time there was, you had a serious wave of voting by young people. And so, there are times when I will ask them, because I know the the financial in parts of the news is not great. We're doing okay, but and I'll say, why do you want to do this? And honestly, the answer usually is, look, I like this. I really like it. And that's kind of what I get, you know, and really all of us, I think, you know, at some advanced ages here, in my case, still feel the same way about it, you know, and it's great to see it, I think. So, yeah, so I don't think they be deterred. That's part of the business. You know, if you're doing your job, you're going to get a lot of pushback, no matter if it's 2020 or 1980.
And your thought about mentorship?
Well, I just think it is. I was thinking when somebody was talking about, you know, younger reporters who come into a big place like Newsday, you know, and I mean, we just don't really have that much time to really mentor them in an active way. I always try to do it, you know, when you see somebody, if they're struggling or if they're kind of off to themselves. So I do think that kind of a situation is, and it's been years, you know, it's busy, the business is busy, everybody's overloaded with work, and the kids sometimes don't get, I think, the attention. You kind of have to, you know, give them attention rather than wait for them to come to you. It's just, to be honest, we try, but I think it would be great if it were better. And but you know, with the staff cuts that have been, you know, hit most places, you have fewer people, I think, doing that sort of a job to reach out. We do it fairly well, but it's, you know, it's a big place.
And we're all about reliable information for making informed decisions. And this is the most important time, at least in my lifetime, for reliable information and informed decisions. Larry, I do want to come back to you now about suburbs and how segregated some of our suburbs may be. A lot of Trump support here, aside from what you might have said about blue suburbs. But even within that, there are Long Island variations. Truck parades in Northport, but upscale luxury car parades in Great Neck. What does that say about us, that even in protest, our status symbols matter?
Well, we are the most segregated place on the planet, according to both anecdotal and academic studies. And that segregation is not necessarily just racial. It's economic, it is religious, and it is political. You can have very heavily Democratic communities cheek to jowl with very heavily Republican ones. We are very, very tribal in all kinds of ways, and it plays out in our politics. That's why it's a very dangerous thing to generalize about Long Island. I mean, I do it all the time, but I try to throw in some caveats. I remember my academic director, Chris Neat, and I were sent a manuscript to read from really one of the best American political demographers, and he wanted us to tell us what he thinks. And his thesis was that the suburbs around the country have reached an inflection point, that they are about to become very integrated, and it's a tremendous chance socially and economically. So I'm thinking, oh, okay. So we read through it, and there were a bunch of places around the country. Then we got to Nassau County, and he made the same case. And we both wrote him back and said, you know, Myron, 20,000 feet, we look really, really integrated. But you get down to 5,000 or lower, and we are what we are, which is incredibly segregated. And I say, you better make sure you're not doing that around the country. And it turned out that he had made this enormous strategic error, flipped it around and wrote the opposite book. So we are both a place that can instruct how people look at the rest of the country. But yes, your question is about segregation. We are, and it affects everything, including the way journalists have to cover communities. And it's so easy, particularly for a young person, not to put down young people, or somebody coming from outside of New York and coming, say, to work at Newsday or the weekly papers, to make assumptions, because we are different than so many other places, even if in the aggregate, the overall, again, the 20,000-foot view, we're the same as Montgomery County, Pennsylvania, and Oakland County, Michigan, and all the places that determine in the swing states who won the election.
Rich Barrabi, that reminds me of a story from earlier in the year. News 12 reporter was covering a protest in Comac and was harassed and apparently in imminent danger. And when I told friends who live back in the mainland United States, their stereotypical image of Long Island was just a wealthy suburb of New York City. We're stunned and surprised to hear that. Please explain that story, Kevin Vesey, the reporter, and any preparation you're giving to your people as they move about Long Island, who, because of the crush of personnel and demands of the job, may not be intimately acquainted with each of those towns as they might have been.
Sure. So that was an eye-opening experience for everybody, I think. Not because there was this groundswell of support for President Trump, though. It was more about the way it unfolded. So we were in a situation where people were really tired of the lockdown on Long Island and New York, and Kevin was covering this rally, and he had pointed out, I believe, that many of the people were not wearing masks, and that set off a lot of people who were at that point, and it holds true now, very tired of hearing about masks and were tired of hearing about lockdown measures. And so Kevin was in the crowd. He was on Facebook Live and he was walking through the crowd, not doing anything to incite the crowd, but someone heard that, and then another person heard that, and you combine that with the narrative that many people believe that we've been talking about here throughout this program, stemming down from the president about the media, and it became a viral moment. And Kevin never intended it to be a viral moment. And in fact, I think Kevin is a real solid, objective journalist, and he's probably the last guy who would go into a crowd thinking, you know, if I go in here and I do this, I could really get this to go viral. That's not Kevin. He's the ultimate journalist, but it just so happened that that's the way it played out. The president ended up retweeting it. It got millions of views, and Kevin all of a sudden was very viral very quickly.
One of those viral accounts, I heard one of the women protesters saying, I've seen your social media posts. I know who you are, which social media is just the modern air we breathe and the water we swim in. Dr. Lindenfeld, I just have to ask you if your students are more sophisticated about that, if you encourage them to participate in social media or to keep up walls so that their news subjects may not know their personal lives or their opinions about issues, so that they can come in as objective reporters of truth. How does that play out among your students?
Well, they are definitely more sophisticated than I am. That's for sure. I think, you know, what they do in their personal lives, there's a certain generational divide. I'm laughing about this because I have a 17-year-old who's on his phone constantly, following everything, tweeting. I'm not sure if the boundaries are the same for them as students learning to be journalists. What I can tell you is we recently hired Sri Srinivasan, who's just brilliant at digital audience building. And he's been with us now 1.5 years, and he teaches a class on how to build digital following that includes effective use of social media.
And I have to ask your opinion, if you will, about the idea of young people coming aboard because we are in contemporary media, of not really knowing or understanding the difference between reporting, analysis, and commentary. Do you have to sort of recalibrate their minds to understand what their roles will be?
I mean, I think that's such a core part of their education. What I've heard from the students recently is that they have found themselves really checking themselves on whether they're expressing an opinion or facts because of how much standard journalistic practice has been demonized during this period. So I think it's heightened their sense of what it means to engage in journalistic practice. And I know that's something our faculty many of whom come from Newsday, take very, very seriously.
It is our credibility. And again, it's about reliable information for making informed decisions. Just a personal note, it concerns me that rather than investing in reporters to cover the news, so many broadcasting outlets will talk about the news, and then we'll have pundits and people who are not as sophisticated or educated will think that is news. So it's uphill, and good luck with your work. So, we are welcome for questions to our panelists.
I am Julie Lane from Times Review, and I'm curious, in the last 4 years, what I've observed out of Washington is that an awful lot of people have been willing to give up their power, something I've never seen before. And yet we've had a president who's been able, it seems to me, to compromise every level of government, from the courts to certainly both houses of Congress to some extent. I'm curious about how you guys see it. Is this my vision alone, or do you see that kind of compromise?
Do you mean people who are leaving Congress, basically, retiring?
No, I'm saying what I've observed is that it appears that people who are in Congress, whether they won this time around or weren't running this time around, people who chose not to run, but seemed willing over the last 4 years to give up their power in many ways, to give up their independence in many ways from the president. And it's understandable that they would, to a certain extent at least, unite with their party vision, but it has been more extreme than I have ever observed over a lot of years of watching politics. And I've just never seen so many people with considerable power give up that power to one person.
Yeah, if I just to be quick about it, I think I see what you're asking now, which is something very different. I think there are, in the Republican Party, this is what we're talking about here basically, in the Senate, but the House as well. They are, I think it's a very understandable political position given how divided the country is, and also, the demographics are moving against them. Their base of supporters and Trump are very excited and energized and, basically pretty much believe in him and what he says. And they're sort of what they have. They can't afford to alienate them, as much as they would, some of them would like to say, we'll, sort of look askance at this guy. You get kind of these mutterings, and the ones who can't take it leave, basically, Jeff Flake and a number of them, because they know they're going to get primaried, and they'll, if they anger Trump and his base, and it's expensive, it's time consuming to run a primary, and they don't want to do it. So I think some of them could run primaries and probably win, but nonetheless. So I that's my perspective on your question.
Thank you.
I think we might have lost JT, but he had a question in the chat, which I think would be interesting for people to address. He said, with record numbers of absentee voters and early voters, how does this impact political campaign coverage going forward?
Going and going and going and going. Election night turned into election week, election weekend, election month, and we'll see where we end. And it's that much more obvious that we don't know winners and losers as quickly as we'd like to. And we need to be mindful of that as we're getting more numbers in. It's easy to jump to a conclusion, but you really got to be careful considering the amount of absentees still out there.
It may be that in rethinking coverage, we really do have to take an election week perspective, that the so-called climax is not necessarily going to come when it used to. And that may take more resources. It may take even educating our readers and viewers that this is going to be a different voting process, and it's going to be a different journalism process. And the challenge is, how do you make that interesting? How do you make that educational? How do you hold your readers and viewers? And I don't have the answers to that. I don't have to have the answers to that anymore. But I think that we're in a different place where process may drive you know, how we cover the news.
I wonder if one of the real world impacts that we're going to see is whether New York voters look around the country, and at a time when there were so many mail and absentee ballots cast, and they see that some states have changed the rules to allow counting to begin before election day in some capacity, that when they look at the system now and we see that we have races in Suffolk County that aren't going to be settled for probably 2 more weeks, that it seems antiquated, and we might see a call for an update to that part of the system, that we can look around the country and see that everybody's in the same boat this year, and some states just have a better system for dealing with the influx of mail and absentee ballots. New York's system is frankly just outdated and needs to be reconsidered, I think.
Yeah, that may change. I mean, here my impression long has been that the political parties, the 2 major ones, really run the operation of the voting system. And I think Larry probably might agree, I don't know, that the reason they don't count them until afterwards is, one, it allows the party lawyers, if you've got a disputed situation, to be right there, you know, hovering over everybody. And you know, so I think the New York system is a much more kind of party-run system maybe than some of these more modern, you know, entities around the country. I think
I think Joe and Jack are both right from different directions. I think you're probably going to see in Pennsylvania and in New York and other places where you can't touch the ballots until election day or even afterwards. I think they're going to move up and become a little more uniform. By the same token, it's expedient for the parties, and I'm not being cynical at all or sarcastic, because this arguing that Jack is talking about, you know, if you don't have to go through it, in other words, if you get a lopsided walk-in situation as you had with Lee Zeldin, why do you need to spend hours and hours and hours fighting over ballots? You know, the hanging chad, our equivalent of them, don't matter. So I think there's a lot of discussion that needs. I think this is something that the editorial pages will probably have more to say than the news pages, and it's probably as it should be.
One question for any or all of the panelists from the moderator. Hello. The effect of down ballot voting in state legislatures may have an effect on the future of the Electoral College. Your observations and opinions in New York and in other states throughout the country?
Well, around the country, it absolutely, for sure. I mean, the failure of that so-called blue wave to materialize meant that Democrats did not take back state houses that they hoped. And the reason that's important, other than the fact that the states under the new federalism, states are where most of the legislative and policy action takes place these days, but it's the power of redistricting. And in New York, even though the Republicans took back seats, they didn't take back enough to be able to have a say in how the lines are drawn for Congress and the state legislature. So New York is going to remain blue. It'll probably get even bluer unless the Democrats decide out of the goodness of their hearts to draw fairer lines. I don't think that'll ever happen. But all around the country, you got an example. I'll try to make this really quick. I'm sorry if I'm rambling here. But in Wisconsin, I think you got a Democratic governor and other Democratic statewide officials. You have hundreds of thousands of more people voted for Democratic state legislative candidates, yet the Republicans control by a long shot both houses of the Wisconsin legislature because of redistricting. The Democrats hoped to change it. They didn't. All around the country, they didn't. So this is, the Republicans are going to be in pretty good shape for Congress for the next 10 years.
Yeah, I would just say 2 quick things. One is you know, one of the Trump strategies appears to be that if they can, in some of these close swing states, if they can, you know, either delay or sort of kind of derail the certification process of the election results, they then, as in Wisconsin, can have some hope of going to the Republican state legislatures, which in many states, you know, name the electors, and to try to, you know, influence it that way. Pennsylvania, which is really the only one, I mean, when Biden won that, he went over the top. The governor, as I understand it, names, and he's a Democrat. So, and then the only other thing about changing the acknowledge sort of the power of it is, I mean, it's just a very arduous process. I would require a constitutional amendment, as I understand it, which would have to get out of Congress, and then it'd have to be approved in every state. And when was the last time that happened? I don't know. You can't even get the Equal Rights Amendment, you know.
Why would red states want to give up power that they have that may be antiquated, but it's theirs? It never
Right.
happened. It's a fantasy. It's an academic conference sort of subject.
Larry, just a question to follow up on that. A lot of people are putting hope in this compact, you know, where the states agree to give their electoral votes to the people, whoever wins the national popular vote. Do you think that'll ever hit a majority?
I don't know. I always was intrigued by that and saddened that they actually had to do that, that there might be a question that somebody would go against the majority of voters in their state. But you'd have to tell me, and I don't know it in a granular way, but you'd have to tell me, has Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan signed on to this? If yes, that's a good thing for those who are rooting for Biden. If not, we could be in a whole world of hurt that we've never seen before in this country, not since the 1860s.
Yeah, I'm presuming the red states that are controlling things, even though they're in the minority, are not going to sign that compact, because that would be the same thing as giving up the Electoral College.
Yeah, no, right. I don't know what the numbers are on that. I don't know which states signed and which didn't.
Okay, Alyssa, you had a question on the chat. Why don't you just ask it out loud?
Hi, everybody. Alyssa Simon. I'm the editor of the Belmont Merrick Herald with Richer Communications. Hi, everyone who I know and do not know. So I wrote in the chat that New York Times journalist Peter Baker has said reporters should, quote, should not participate in elections and or politics, and to that extent believes we should not vote. Do you think journalists should abstain from the democratic process? Why or why not? Joe already.
I will add to that. When I was in school, a part of a group of students, a cohort of students who were inspired by the Watergate era, I was appalled when our professors said we should not vote because it would compromise, that somehow people would know and they would think that we were biased in some way. I think it's exponential now with social media. So I am curious about what our panelists think.
I think it's ludicrous. I really do. I think the idea that we should be, I guess what we should be is monks who live, we should live off somewhere and eat thin gruel all day and just, I mean, that's ridiculous. I think the more interesting question is about social media and expressing opinions on social media, because there's no question. I've always said that I don't believe a journalist, you don't check your citizenship at the door when you show up for work. You're a citizen of the United States. It's ludicrous to me that anybody would suggest you shouldn't vote. I mean, that's so far beyond the pale, I can't grasp it. I've heard the arguments that journalists shouldn't register with a specific party. I'm actually a no affiliation registrar for that reason. I wouldn't say that's something I would mandate from anybody that worked with me, because you have a right to your own opinion, and journalists are allowed to have opinions. I have opinions. I don't necessarily, the goal is for me to set those opinions aside to do my job. And if I do my job properly, it doesn't matter what my opinions are because I'm objective as a journalist. And the idea that somehow participating in the political process just throws mud on me to be able to observe that process is just ridiculous. That's all I can say. I just think that's crazy.
Laura, what if you pose this question to the kids out there at Stony Brook? Do you think you'd get a different...
They'd drop out and go somewhere else.
They would?
I mean, I think this is the essential question, right? You may have your opinions, but your job is to deliver facts, and we're going to train you to do that.
Right.
I mean, who out there would expect anybody not to have an opinion right now about what's happening in this country? Everybody has an opinion, and I understand that we need to keep that separate. And I actually made a decision about social media some time ago that I was always very careful about my positions on social media, which were about what I thought, but I tried to back it up with here's why I think what I think. But I stopped doing that after a while because I realized that social media has become sort of a cesspool, and there's not really much point in trying to do anything constructive there. But I don't think that means that I would, for instance, if I hired a young journalist, I wouldn't expect them not to have a social media presence. I would expect them to have a responsible social media presence, which is not the same thing.
This idea of not voting, I think, is nuts. I'd argue with anybody if they really want to make a serious case for it. I'm pure in my heart, and I'll be the one who knows that I've taken a side. I think that's crazy. But I think that a journalist should not enroll in a political party. I understand that's problematic if you live in a place where the primaries are tantamount to the general election. There was a primary I wanted to vote in. I became a Democrat for about 3 days, and then I went back to being an independent blank. But the social media thing, that's a whole different breed of cat. You are a new, the lines between news and opinion have been so blurred. I think that's the worst thing that's happened in our industry. And nobody can tell the difference anymore, at least the great the great swath of readership. The idea of expressing, when I was a reporter for the 10 years I was on the news side in Newsday, expressing my opinion publicly, even at a speaking engagement, out beyond my family or closest friends, it made my skin crawl. And when they asked me to be an editorial writer, it really struck me as something really antithetical to all the values that I cared about. But you can't have your cake and eat it too. I think that an aspiring, a youngster can have two social media presences. You can have a very small circle for your closest friends and family, and you can call Donald Trump or Joe Biden, as the case might be, anything you want publicly. And I know some of the reporters at News 12 used to do that, a whole different persona, which was more in keeping with the values of the profession and the station.
I have to be honest.
You have to be really, really careful about giving people fodder for claiming fake news. They'll do it anyways, but at least don't make it easy for them.
I have to be honest with you, Larry. That scares me even more when people have two different accounts, because that account always ends up, people find out about it and they'll see those comments. And I think it removes the rails a little bit so that you're not as careful publicly.
Maybe you're right, but it seems that that for what the general public sees, you gotta be pure. I used to kid around. People would say, "What do you do?" I said, "I'm in the priesthood. I have a mission. I don't make much money." Now it's all mission and no money. And you got to look at it that there's a purity to what we do, and a purity that I frankly miss. And when I tell people I used to be a journalist, they look at me like, "Oh, lucky you don't do that anymore." And not because maybe I'm making a few bucks more, not because I get to hang out with students all the time, but because it's a profession that a lot of people think you're looked down at, when it was just not like that when I was a reporter. People looked up to you.
Larry, excuse me, just one thought on this, especially that you and Jack are with, or you are associated with Newsday from your career, and Jack, how about people who assume bias on the part of a reporter because of the company they work for? Someone might be a legit reporter working for Fox, for example. And I know when I came to Long Island, people just perceived that Newsday was going to be biased toward any liberal causes, regardless of how scrupulous reporters were about doing their jobs. Your thoughts for people, given today's climate, how to navigate that?
Yeah, I think as far as Newsday is concerned, this idea, will not die. And Joe Mondella, who was the Republican chairman for a long time, you'd see him on election night, and
who brought Nixon to Nassau.
Yeah. And look, I know in very recent years, there's a very large, strenuous push by the top here at Newsday to make stuff balanced. And I think it is, for the most part, very good, because people, me, everybody else, you have your feelings and they creep in. And And I mean, I spend time not because of that, but just because of the number of complaints of unfairness I've gotten over the years. I literally sometimes in these candidate profiles will almost count the number of paragraphs we devote to each candidate, you know, to be that fair about it. It doesn't make for the most interesting story a lot of times, but I think it's important to show the effort. So and what I'm trying to say is this is very different than what people think about goes on at Newsday. And I do think the editorial side, you can't ever explain that it's a whole separate operation and they have opinions and we don't. So I don't know. We try.
Holly has had a question. Holly.
So I've noticed in the last few days on some of my conservative leaning friends and also trending on news channels that people are dumping Fox for Newsmax and they're dumping Twitter for Parler. And Newsmax is clearly not a legitimate news site. They don't, you know, check facts like legitimate journalists would. So what are your thoughts on people who are not really interested in learning facts? They're interested in learning facts that support their narrative and are changing their news habits to follow that.
And are we doomed?
I taught for 3 semesters in the news literacy program at Stony Brook, and I can't help but think it was trying to hold our hands up against the onrushing tide, because we talk about whether journalists know the difference, young journalists. I don't think most people any longer know the difference between news and opinion and editorials. And frankly, I'm not sure some journalists do either. The lines have been so blurred. And I think the biggest crisis we have in this country right now is our information infrastructure is broken. And I don't know how we fix it. I keep telling myself that at the local level, newspapers like ours still have credibility with our community because we live in our community and people see that our job is to reflect our community. It's not to dictate anything to them. It's to see what's happening around us. And if there's a Trump rally that comes through on a Sunday that creates a traffic jam, that's going on my front page. It doesn't really come into play what I think about that rally. It's just not a factor. And so we have that connection to our readers. It's shaky because I think every journalist right now has a shaky relationship, but we still have that connection to our readers. And so it's kind of up to us to lead the charge, to try and drag people back to fact, to keeping their focus on what are the facts, what is the absolute truth here. And so we have to do our job at the local level. I think it's twice as important that we do our job as well as we possibly can, because we have to sort of begin to set a pace to show our readers what real journalism looks like. And there are so many outlets that just don't have that. They don't care to do that. They're not trying to show anybody good journalism. They're just trying to get clicks and that's the only measure of success. And that's a real catastrophe for journalism in general.
I have a couple thoughts on this, if I may. First of all, I'm so glad you taught in news literacy. I think news literacy is really important, and we continue that program. I want to talk for a moment about the work that the Aldous Center does, because it's a little different than what we're talking about here. And I'm not naive to think that interpersonal relationship building could overcome the kind of challenges we face across the media industry, but they do matter. And what we're doing in the Aldous Center is we're working with scientists to help them become more responsive to audiences, to people, to really listen and be empathic. That doesn't mean they agree with a perspective that's different from their own, but it means they treat that person with dignity and civility and hear them. And I firmly believe that interpersonal connections that are meaningful can help us to bridge some of this divide, because the more you're just reading the news outlets you follow, some of them I wouldn't even call news, but people do, the further entrenched you're going to become in that tribal thinking. So I think it takes a lot of bravery to do that. And I've seen some scientists really step up and take on challenges. I also think we need to be looking at other thought leaders who can partner with us around fact-based information like science, religious leaders who can bring information to communities. So it's not exactly through a journalistic approach, but it can enhance our ability to understand the difference between fact and lies and who to trust. It all boils down to trust. Who do you trust?
Well, trust and respect. And a question for Rich Barrabi. Rich, I don't want to neglect you here, but you are, you're located in, I don't know if anybody's still in the studio anymore in Nassau County. We're talking about respect, civility, communicating, and back to the local angle on a national issue. Congressman Tom Suozzi, Vice Chairman of the Problem Solvers Caucus. And you would think a problem solver would be somebody we could get behind in this climate at this time, but things are notoriously tight right now. And are you surprised that things were so close in his district?
I think we really need to see the absentee ballots come in. I think there's a lot of outstanding ballots in that district. And so the Santos campaign, actually the candidate himself on Twitter, has been kind of echoing the president. He is alleging voter suppression. He's actually going to be on my show tomorrow. I'm going to ask him directly about this, about what evidence he has. And this ties into the Fox News angle that Holly brought up. The reason why a lot of people are moving away from Fox News, at least apparently, is because they did their job. Fox News has a decision desk that called Arizona before anyone, even before the AP. That wasn't an opinion-based decision. That was based on the data and the stats they had. And it angered the president. It angered a lot of his supporters. And now what Fox News has done in the days that have followed is they've challenged the president's narrative that there's widespread fraud. That's what journalists are supposed to do. But unfortunately, in the climate we're in right now, people are looking for their home team newscasts. If the Mets play the Yankees, and I'm a Mets fan, I go to the SNY post game because that's the Mets station. People view politics the same way now.
I think the Fox reporters did a really good job during the election, particularly election week. I watch Fox a lot because I want to get a better sense of what another side is thinking. And ironically, because the Fox reporters have been playing it so straight, the difference between fact and opinion has never been more stark on that station, because they've essentially marginalized Hannity, Ingraham, and Carlson. When they come on, that's something very, very different, somewhere between opinion and propaganda, than what the reporters are talking about. And I think that's, in a way, ironically, maybe perversely, a good thing.
Can we count on ownership to have idealism, or can we count on them to strictly follow the money?
A thought I've had over the past week, as journalists out on the streets every day, I'm sure most of us have been accused of fake news. For the panelists, do you think with Joe Biden's win, this will fizzle out or get worse?
Nothing's going to change. My standard line was, this is exactly the same country one day after election day as it was one day before. Nothing is really different. I think the change in the White House that's coming is significant, but it won't change the divisive nature of what we have in this country now. It'll be very fascinating to watch a President-elect Biden's first term and see how he deals with this, because it'll be interesting to see if stability is possible, and if it is, whether that'll be something of a rectifier, because I think a lot of what we have right now with the divisiveness is because of just the chaotic nature of life in the last 4 years. And some of that was actively the result of the president, and some of it wasn't. I mean, who could have foreseen the pandemic? And, it's going to be, I don't think it's not like anything changed significantly in this country on election day. I think it just was an election that has the potential to sow some seeds for change. We'll see. I think that's all we can do.
No, a lot of people didn't trust us.
Go ahead.
I'm just going to say, a lot of people didn't trust us before Trump. he seized on that and he was able to capitalize on it, but that remains.
I mean, how this plays out will have a lot to do with how Trump and particularly his kids decide to play it. If they go kicking and screaming and decide to set up, I'm talking figuratively now, a parallel government, this fake news thing is going to be at the central pillar of what they're going to promote. If they decide to go away a little gracefully, if it fits their business plan, literally their business plan, or their political aspirations, the kids know that they need to be able to make some inroads back with moderate suburbanites, then maybe things will cool down a little bit. But it's really, Trump controls this for not just the next few months, but for the next 4 years.
You know, I'm not sure I agree with you. I think if we've almost all forgotten how divisive a character he was on purpose. He had an uncanny ability to find the cleave point and get in there and turn it. He just did, whether you like it or not. It was a little bit like having, you know, somebody like Roy Cohn as president in that respect. I think if you have a different tone every single day from the top and a guy who's not in everybody's face every day or all day long, I do think that lack of divisiveness and at least an effort isn't going to fix it. But I do think you're not going to see perhaps as extreme a situation as we've had. He really saw that for what the opportunity that was there.
I think everybody's just exhausted.
I hope you're right. I hope you're right, Jack.
Everybody's just exhausted on both sides too, and I think it takes a lot of energy to have this much division, and it may well be if there's an opening for people to start beating swords into plowshares, it may start happening. We'll see. I'm hopeful.
If at this point the COVID crisis isn't enough to have at least a handoff of scientists who are ready to address this sometime between now and January 20th, when we have as many as 1,000 deaths a day between now and then, what's it going to take? Isn't that enough emotional impetus to get us off the mark and convince the current crew to at least help get the other crowd on board to begin saving lives? I think it was Bob Dole who said, "Where's the outrage?" This is completely outrageous.
Brendan had a question.
Hi, I'm Brendan O'Reilly. I'm the Vice President of the PCLI board, and I'm also a journalist for the Express News Group. My question, and maybe Rich, you could take this off the top, was congressional and presidential polls useful to your reporting before Election Day, or maybe at the time you thought it was useful? And post-election day, how much trust do you place in the polls? As journalists ourselves, we report on the polls. We're not the one taking polls. But when we start with bad information, it reflects poorly on us when we're the ones bringing that information to the public.
Yeah, the polling industry, which I am not a member of, is going to have to do some real soul searching because they got it wrong in a lot of states. They may not have gotten the outcome wrong, but they got the margins very wrong. You look at Wisconsin, there was a prominent poll that had Biden up 17 points about a week before Election Day. Obviously, that didn't happen. Biden won Wisconsin relatively comfortably, but not 17 points. And for some reason, there's a large segment of the country that is equating the polls with the media. I don't know if it's maybe because of what you say that we report on the polls. But now fake polls and fake news are kind of coming together. So I'm not too reliant on the polls, because they got it wrong in 2016 at the state level. Again, you can look at the popular vote, but that's not how we determine who the president is. So the state
it wasn't even close with the popular vote. The polling industry, and I was part of the polling industry in 2016 because I was overseeing Hofstra's national suburban poll in those days. And there were a lot of soul searching in the industry. A lot of adjustments were made, and particularly with the lesser educated white rural voters, and they overwhelmed the adjustments. At least that's what it seems like now. State polls are always a problem. The reason that people, if they do associate polls with media, is that most media companies now have polls. And that's an interesting question of whether they should have polls. I mean, we used to go through this whole idea of whether, back in my time, whether reporters should be real estate testers, whether reporters themselves should go out like Newsday did eventually, a fantastic series on the real estate industry, because you need this distance, the idea of a distance for it. Maybe newspapers, TV stations shouldn't do their own polls. I don't know what the answer is, but everybody's in a rush to do them. Universities want to do them for identification, and a lot of people don't do them well. A lot of people rely on other companies to do the hard work of it, both the scientific and the gut work of it. So I don't know what the answer is, but we were way, way off this year, farther off than they were in 2016.
JD had several questions, and I think we should end with that because we're running out of time. So JD, why don't you ask your questions as the end of the program here?
Hey folks, thanks so much for everybody joining us today. My name is JD. I'm a board member of PCLI, and I'm the assistant news director and at WSHU and an adjunct at Stony Brook University School of Journalism. This is kind of pointed at all three of those elements all at once, is that through COVID and now the aftermath of the elections, daily data reporting has become an integral part of what we give to our audiences every day. But it's not something that necessarily today's journalists or today's audiences are able to understand every day. How do we connect better with our audiences so that way they can understand that this data impacts their daily lives? Free for all, go for it.
Are you talking about people we present the data, it's not clearly in a way people can grasp? We do a lot of data work.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think that I know that everybody, all media outlets now are feeding daily percentages of cases, 7-day averages. We're handing them absentee ballot numbers. We're handing them percentage of registered voters, and people are looking at these numbers and they do not know how it connects to them and what they care about.
Yeah.
So how do we better explain these data points and connect it to either the overall big picture context or the emotion that drives the story?
I think major media are doing the kinds of data research and analysis that used to be only the province of places like a National Center for Suburban Studies. It is highly sophisticated, yet it is presented in a way, Newsday does, Times is superb at it, other organizations, but presented in a way that the typical average person can understand. It's packaged with graphics as well, and even video, in a way that makes me blush. I wish I could do I had the horses and the resources to do more of that stuff through my own center. The Times on the day after the election, came out with a study of 300 and some odd suburban counties. They recognize that the suburbs are the swing voters. If you know what's going on in suburbs, you know what's going on in the rest of the country. And the next day, they had this analysis that showed Biden won by 4.6% in 300 and something suburban counties. I mean, my jaw dropped at that. I mean, again, you'd think Brookings would do it, maybe we would do it because it's focused, but this was a newspaper. And I think that with the sophistication of some of the young people now, in knowing how to use websites, knowing how to use data, I think this is the kind of work that can happen at the weeklies, which don't have the same resources, of course. But if the papers decide to see what kind of talent they may have and the skills they may have that they don't even realize, you could do that on the village level and the town level as well.
Certainly, I think your question, JD, I love it. It speaks to the need for more interdisciplinarity around journalism. And I look at like the data scientists at Stony Brook. I feel like in our students' education, we need to have some collaborations. I was telling JD before, we've got a new curriculum, and one of the classes we're teaching is data and storytelling so that we can bridge social science, quantitative approaches to understanding data, what they actually mean. Like you have to know what a p-value is to be able to interpret certain kinds of data. And if you don't understand that, how can you report on it? And then how do you turn that into a compelling story? So I'll be really curious to see. We'll start this class in the spring, how it pans out for the students. But I think they need to come out with those tools.
It's news literacy and media literacy.
Visualization tools, media literacy, it's all part of the backpack.
And data literacy, statistics.
Data literacy for sure.
For TV, it's science.
Science.
And the numbers.
I am just so pleased to have been a part of a discussion like this. I'm just so grateful for everyone to participate. And Bill, thank you so much for directing and quarterbacking. Rich knows how important it is to have a director in the booth telling you what's going on and where to direct you. Just a reminder for anyone who is watching to visit PCLI.org for more information about our panelists and their unique stories, and for a recording of this session. There will be a recording placed at PCLI.org within a couple of days. So just allow, if I may, that for all the conversation about bubbles and different groups, demographics, someone I respected said that we're not here to seek balance per se, we're here to pursue the truth. So again, thank you for joining us, and look to PCLI.org for our activities and upcoming events. And we look forward to seeing you again soon.
Thanks for having me.
Thanks. It was fun.
Thanks, it was fun.
Sorry for talking too much.